Another one from the Express, home of the Daily and Sunday Express. Well, could this be true? Russian airstrike successes finally shame U.S. into ramping up attacks on ISIS. Russia's ferocious campaign of airstrikes on Islamic State is forcing the United States into ramping up attacks on the terror organization. It has been revealed October 21st, 6 days ago. General Dunford left is putting together a strategy to improve ISIS attacks. The Pentagon is putting in a plan to reboot its strategy in the Middle East after continuous failures to reclaim the ISIS-controlled cities of Ramadi and Mosul in Iraq. Both Washington and Baghdad are said to have grown frustrated at the lack of progress, and pressure is now being put on Iraq's Prime Minister Haider al-Abadi to ask Moscow to conduct airstrikes in the country. It comes after a Syrian MP revealed Vladimir Putin's relentless campaign of bombing in the country has achieved more against ISIS in 15 days than the U.S. did in a year in the war-torn country. Russia and U.S. have regularly clashed over Middle Eastern policy in the recent weeks, including over airspace. That was heightened yesterday when Moscow released a video of a Russian fighter jet passing just beneath a U.S. Reaper drone in a near miss in Syria. America's new strategy, which is expected to be outlined to Congress next week, is being led by Military Commander General Joseph Dunford, who has said he has received assurances from Abadi he will not seek help from Russia, something the Kremlin is said to be keen to offer. Iraqi soldiers stands and amid ISIS ammunitions. The new U.S. plan will include coordinating groups attacking ISIS in Iraq, including Baghdad's security forces, Kurdish fighters known as the Peshmerga, and Sunni tribes. It will also involve the U.S. working with Iranian-backed Shia militias for the first time. Dunford, who has just returned from visiting a range of countries in the Middle East, said he was asking his top advisors to come up with recommendations on how the U.S.-led coalition could motivate the Iraqi forces and pick up the pace of the operations. Shia Muslims capture an ISIS flag in Iraq. Dunford didn't provide specifics, but said some of it could include additional training, more equipment, or improving how the coalition is working together. U.S. airstrikes began in Iraq a year ago when the Iraqi army collapsed under intense pressure from insurgents. After early successes, progress on the ground has stalled, but there are signs of improvement. Syrian President Assad sprung a surprise visit on Putin yesterday. Dunford said, 3 or 4 weeks ago there was no movement at all around Ramadi, no movement toward Beijing. Now we see more movement than we've seen before, movement that I think we can take a look at and say, okay, how do we reinforce success now? A year ago, ISIL was making progress unchecked. So I'm not trying to put lipstick on a pig here. I'm trying to be honest about where we are. The momentum of ISIL was stopped. They have lost ground. Iraqi officials said the U.S. has already begun increasing airstrikes in the country. The Pentagon said there had been 70 raids on ISIS targets over the last 2 weeks. However, that has paled in comparison to Russia's offensive on terrorists in Syria.
Vladimir Putin came to Finland with a handshake for his counterpart and a warning that Moscow will respond if his host country joins NATO. Finland and neighbouring Sweden have increased cooperation with the Western military alliance since Russia's annexation of Crimea and its backing for separatist rebels in eastern Ukraine. This was Putin's first visit to Finland since those crises erupted. What do you think we'd do, he said, if Finland joined NATO? We moved our forces back 1,500 kilometres away. Would we keep them there? How they assure the safety and independence of their country is the Finns' choice. Undoubtedly, we appreciate Finland's neutral status. The President's meeting at Naantali comes amid increased Russian and NATO activity in the Baltic region. Finland is militarily neutral, but interest in the possibility of joining the alliance has been rising. The former Soviet Baltic states have called on NATO to step up air defences. The Baltic Sea has been the arena for a series of close encounters between Russian and Western aircraft in recent months. A NATO summit takes place in Warsaw in a week's time.
Russia and Iran sign a new military agreement allowing Russian jets to use an Iranian airbase for anti-ISIL missions in Syria.
In an unprecedented move, Russia has begun using an airbase in Iran to conduct bombing missions over Syria. The Russian Defense Ministry says its long-range bombers have carried out airstrikes against Daesh from the west of Iran at the Hamadan airbase. It's thought to be the first time Russian military aircraft have been deployed from Iranian soil in half a century.
Russia's defense ministry said that Moscow has deployed Russian bombers to an Iranian airbase to widen its campaign in Syria. But these bombers have already targeted militant targets in Syria. Well, Russia's defense ministry says that those are Tupolev 22 M3 long-range bombers and Sukhoi 34 fighter bombers, and they were launched from a Hamadan airbase in Iran. Well, according to reports, it's cheaper and quicker to fly them from Hamadan. This could reduce flying time by 60% and also could allow to increase the load on the plane. Before this, Russia was flying these bombers from its base in North Ossetia because its base in Latakia in Syria is not big enough for them. But flying time, the distance to Palmyra from North Ossetia is around 2,000 kilometers, whereas this distance to Palmyra from Hamadan is around 900 kilometers. But certainly Russia and Iran share similar goals in Syria, and they are allies in the region. And both Russia and Iran are part of the same coalition fighting Daesh in Syria.
International news now, where it seems there's increasing cooperation over Syria. It follows Iran allowing Russia to use an airbase, and now China saying it will offer military help to the Syrian government.
Learning that China is seeking closer military ties with Syria, a senior Chinese military official just visited Damascus, where he met with the Syrian defense minister. According to the agency, the Chinese and Syrian officials also talked about the possibility for China to provide military training and humanitarian aid to Syria. This talk about the possibility of China providing military training to Syrian government forces marks a change in China's more detached approach to the war in Syria. China had previously praised Russia's role there, but it may now provide more specific support to the fight against terrorists. The Chinese news agency also reported that while in Damascus, the Chinese military official also met with the Russian general. So you have a potential alliance forming not only with China, but also with Iran.
China and Russia are permanent members of what's called the Shanghai Cooperation Organization. Iran wants to become a member. There's about 17 countries in all that either are permanent members, partners, which also include Turkey, Iran, India, Pakistan, and all the countries in Central Asia. It is a large organization. What's intriguing is that Russia is pivoting more toward the east.
Now, the United States, Poland, and the 3 Baltic states have voiced concern over Russia's deployment of nuclear-capable missiles close to the 4 European Union countries' borders. U.S. State Department Deputy Spokeswoman Marie Harf confirmed that the U.S. had urged Russia to not take steps that would destabilize the region. Russian Foreign Ministry spokesman Igor Konashenkov says the missiles will be deployed in Kaliningrad in the Western Military District. For years, Russia threatened to deploy missiles in response to the United States' plan to install a NATO missile system in Eastern Europe. Moscow says the NATO missiles are a threat to Russian national security. Russian media reports say the newly deployed missiles can hit NATO targets located in Poland, Lithuania, and even Germany. Joining us on the line from London now is Christopher Walker. He's a former Moscow correspondent of The Times. Many thanks for joining us here on Press TV, Mr. Walker. Now, as we've just reported, Russia has been threatening for years to deploy missiles in response to the United States, a missile system in Eastern Europe. Why do you think Russia has chosen now to deploy them?
Well, I think one thing is that the U.S. have not done anything to live up to their promises, rather vaguely made, to take down that missile system. And two, what's going on in Ukraine, where the European Union appears to be trying to, as it were, influence the uprising and secure Ukraine into its position of influence, whereas Russia very much opposes this. I think this is very much a warning sign, a bit of saber rattling at a time when tension is growing between the West and Russia.
So, considering how the situation stands right now, we are seeing this power struggle between the West and Moscow being fought out in Ukraine, as you mentioned, and now along the lines of this NATO missile system. How do you think the way things are going to escalate from here on? Are both sides going to show restraint, or are we going to see more tit-for-tat moves?
I think more tit-for-tat moves. Russia has always been very keen, since the collapse of the Soviet Empire, as it were, to maintain its own power over what it calls its near borders, its near foreign rights, and anything that's done against that, remember the war with Georgia not long ago, is going to provoke action from Moscow. Mr. Putin will not tolerate any sort of attempts, like in Ukraine, to poach what he regards as territory that should be loyal to Russia.
Well, that's Putin. How do you see Obama responding, though?
I don't know exactly, because Obama has so far been so shaky in his various responses, not standing up in Syria to what was threatened about red lines, and very worried about any idea of American troops being called into action. I think this will probably lead him to try and step up diplomatic steps and send John Kerry, his Secretary of State, to try and do something about this. But he may not succeed if those missiles of the American side remain in place.
Well, that's an interesting point you make there, considering how Obama has been shaky on many issues. And many point out that does spring from the fact that the United States isn't as strong as it used to be politically, economically, and militarily speaking. So can the U.S. even afford to irk Russia's wrath?
Well, less and less so, I would say. And there's not a great deal of support for that within the United States. The American public is becoming famously isolationist, as it used to be. It's had enough of this foreign involvement. And, you know, now that Germany is not playing the role that it did, I think there is real pressure on Obama not to push this. Putin has always shown that he's willing to go the extra mile, and it could be a confrontation that Obama doesn't want.
All right, that was Christopher Walker, former Moscow correspondent of The Times. They're joining us on the line from London. Mr. Walker, it's always a pleasure having you with us here on Press TV.